Good evening, my dear brothers and sisters and young people. We're going to look then at the subject of Esther tonight, and we've just read from Esther chapter 7 and seen the dramatic events there as Haman is put to death and the king's wrath is pacified in those dramatic events. And we know the story of the Book of Esther in those 10 chapters which bring out the way in which the Jews were preserved, although Haman had the design to put to death all the Jews in all of the empire of the Medes and Persians. And we read this book and we see the dramatic events it contains, but it's noteworthy that there is no direct reference to God in the Book of Esther, a comment which applies only to this book and to the Song of Solomon. And yet, when we read this book, it's very clear to see that God's hand is at work. And similarly today, God's angels are at work. The Most High rules in the kingdom of men. And also, God is at work in the lives of believers. The angels are at work today as the ministers of those who are called to salvation. And yet we can only see God at work today through the eye of faith. And so tonight's talk, looking at Esther, very much follows on from some of the things we've been looking at over the last few weeks as we've looked at the work of the angels. And I'd like to turn across to Daniel chapter 10, please, a reference which we have looked at in that earlier study, just to remind ourselves of the way in which the angels are at work and do work at God's behest to bring about the purpose of God unseen by mankind at large. And so in Daniel chapter 10 we have the angel of God speaking to Daniel, and we read in verse 10 of Daniel chapter 10, "Behold, a hand touched me, which set me on my knees and upon the palms of my hands. And he said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright, for unto thee am I now sent." When he had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling. So Daniel stands before the angel. Then said he unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. And so just in this example we see the angel explaining to Daniel the work that he's been doing in the background, unseen by humankind, that he was withstanding he was withstood by the king of Persia for 21 days. But there Michael, the chief of the princes, came and helped him. And so there in the background, God is at work bringing about his purpose. And we remember other references we've looked at, and only to turn across to Hebrews chapter 1. But the work of the angels is described there when it says, "To which of the angels said he at any time, Sit on my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool? Are they not all ministering spirits, sent forth to minister for them who shall be the heirs of salvation?" And so the angels are at work as ministers, ministering to those who are the heirs of salvation, to those who are the saints called to salvation through Christ Jesus. And we think of those words in Psalm 34 and verse 7, that the angel of Yahweh encamps round about those that fear him and delivereth them. And it's in the context of knowing these things from the Word of God, that we are able to then open the Book of Esther and we see God's hidden presence, God's hidden work, although it's not explicit within the text, a hidden work bringing about deliverance for Esther, Mordecai, and for the people, the Jews in general. When we think about what we see here in this book of Esther, God's work of deliverance is a pattern for the work of deliverance which is being prepared by the angels as we speak. And so thinking about Esther in this way, we can get an exciting insight, which is relevant to us today. And so we're going to be looking briefly this evening then at the Book of Esther and the work of God bringing salvation to the Jews in this book. But first of all, I just want to look at an interesting aside. We've mentioned the fact that the Book of Esther doesn't contain the name of God at all. It's a well-known fact that God is absent from the record, and the Jews and other students of the Bible, having an awareness of this, have identified that the memorial name, Yahweh, does appear 4 times in the Book of Esther as an acrostic. And in the Companion Bible, Bullinger has a section which talks about this, and he says this: "It's been observed by many that no divine name or title is found in the Book of Esther. This is more remarkable since in this short book of only 167 verses, the Median king is mentioned 192 times. His kingdom is referred to 26 times, and his name, Ahasuerus, is given 29 times." And he goes on to say, Yahweh had declared in Deuteronomy 31 that if his people forsook him, he would hide his face from them. Here this threatening was fulfilled, but though he was hidden from them, he was working for them. Though the book reveals him as overruling all, his name is hidden. It is there for his people to see, but not for his enemies to see or hear. And he goes on to say, his working was secret and hidden, hence the name Jehovah or Yahweh is hidden secretly 4 times in this book. The name Aya, I am that I am, is there once. The Masorah has a rubric calling attention to the former fact, these 4 occurrences of the name Yahweh, and at least 3 ancient manuscripts are known in which the acrostic letters in all 5 cases are written in text which is larger than others, so they stand out boldly and prominently, showing the 4 consonant letters of the name Yahweh in Hebrew. And so the English, what we would have in the authorised version as Lord in capital letters, the Hebrew letters for the name Yahweh are there as an acrostic. And so just to illustrate that, hopefully you can see, good job we've got 2 projectors, isn't it? But this one here, you see outlined in red. This is the part of the text of the Book of Esther, and you see the first letter of each of the 4 words there in the Hebrew are much bigger than the rest of the text. And so here's the Hebrew letter Yod and Hey, War and Hey. So those are the consonants of the name Yahweh. And that occurs 4 times in the book. And so he goes on to comment on that. He says the first 2 acrostics are a pair, having the name formed by the initial letters of the 4 words. The last 2 are a pair, having the name formed by the final letters of the 4 words. The first and third acrostics are a pair having the name spelt backward, and that's the case on the one here. I think Hebrew being written from right to left. The letters are H, W, H, Y, which is the name Yahweh in the Hebrew would come out backwards in that particular case. and the second and fourth are a pair having the name spelt forward, and they form an alternation: backward, forward, backward, forward. The first two acrostics are a pair having the name formed by initial letters of the four words, and the second are a pair spelt forward. And so that's just an interesting observation. It doesn't really have a great bearing on the subject of God's work, but it is interesting that there within the text the name of God is there hidden in this acrostic, just looking at the first or the last letters of those words. So returning then to the main subject of this evening, we're going to look then at the events in Esther. And the events in Esther do not record amazing miracles like the parting of the Red Sea or the sun standing still. They are apparently a series of events just which happen. But they're not, are they? They're not random events or a series of coincidences. The events had to happen in the right way, and they had to happen in the right order. God's promises were at stake in what was going on here in the time of Esther. When we think about the different factors which come together in the events as it comes to its climax towards the end of the book, it had to have Haman's rise to power and also his hatred of the Jews. We needed to have Mordecai the Jew sat there in the gate in order for him to be hated by Haman, which generated that desire to destroy all the Jews. We had to have the Gentile queen Vashti taken out of the way and replaced by the faithful Jewish queen Esther. The timing of the events throughout the months of the year covered by this book had to allow for communication throughout the empire and deliverance and the victory of the Jews. And in the events of Esther, God's promises were at stake. And so God was in control to ensure that his promises were not broken. So let's have a think then about some of the aspects relating to the man Haman. We're going to look at the main characters as we go through. If we turn back in Esther to the 3rd chapter, that's where we are introduced to Haman. And it's interesting that Haman is exalted in the first couple of verses of Esther chapter 3. The chapter opens, "After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him." After what things? The last verse of the 2nd chapter records the faithful act of Mordecai in saving the king from those who wanted to assassinate him. When inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out, therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. It was after these things did King Ahasuerus promote not Mordecai, but Haman. So Haman was exalted, not Mordecai at this time. And Haman, we're told in that first verse, was an Agagite. And this then brings forward a whole context, doesn't it, to us. Let's just go back to the old earlier references. First of all, in Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 15. Remember the events of 1 Samuel chapter 15, where Saul was commanded to destroy all the Amalekites. Verse 2 says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, and how he laid wait for them in the way when he came out from Egypt. Go now and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. So King Saul was directed to destroy the Amalekites. And the king of the Amalekites is named in verse 8. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. So Saul failed to do what he had been told to do, and as a result he's told that the kingdom's going to be taken from him. But what I want to pick up from 1 Samuel 15 is this link which the Book of Esther gives to us, that Haman was an Agagite, descended or linked then with Agag, the king named here, who was an Amalekite. And let's just go back from Samuel to the record in Exodus chapter 17, where 1 Samuel 15 was referring us to. Exodus 17 is that time of the Exodus when Israel fought against the Amalekites. And Joshua led Israel in that battle. And verse 13 says of Exodus 17, Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And Yahweh said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called it Jehovah Nissi, for he said, because Yahweh hath sworn that Yahweh will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. And so here in the context in Exodus and then brought out in Samuel, we see the background to Haman being introduced as an Agagite. So we've got the history, we've got the events here in Esther, and then we can think to the future. When we get to the final destruction of the haters of the Jews, Ezekiel 38, the power is called Gog. There's again with a link there to the idea of Agag. The haters of the Jews are going to be defeated. And what does Haman want to do? Coming back to Esther chapter 3. He's been exalted above all the princes that are with him. And everyone does him reverence. Apart from one man, Mordecai, at the end of verse 2. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. And as a result of that, the result of one man's action, Haman wanted to destroy the Jews completely. And so verse 4 says, now it came to pass that they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them. And they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. We'll come on to that a little later. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath, and thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. And so Haman's desire was to annihilate the Jews. And so when he set to work on doing this, he wanted to choose a date on which to carry out the massacre of all Jews. And we read in verse 7 then, in the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And so they cast lots to see which day of the month it was going to be, and from month to month to see which month of the year it was going to be. Would it be there and then in the first month? Would it be in the second month? No, it was in the last month of the year, in the 12th month. And as things work out in the record of the book, we see that having the destruction of the Jews set out as being 11 months away, this gave plenty of time for preparation and communication of the reversal of the destruction of the Jews as it turned out at the end of the book. And so we're reminded of those words of the Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 31, concerning the lot. There's no mention of God in the book of Esther, but Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of Yahweh." And so God's hand was at work, making sure that the lot fell on that 12th month. And this gave plenty of time for the outworking of his purpose, for the reversal of the desires of Haman, and for the salvation of the Jews. And so those are some thoughts about God's hand in the work of Haman. Let's think about Esther next then. We've said that in order for the final events to work out, this Gentile queen Vashti had to be taken out of the way. And so we know the recording in Esther chapter 1 about Vashti's refusal to obey the king's command, and her fall, and therefore the search for a new queen. And when we come to Esther chapter 2, we read about Esther, and in verse 8, verse 7 says that about Mordecai, he had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So it came to pass, when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. And then verse 9, and the maiden pleased him. Hegai, the keeper of the women, she pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him. And he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maidens unto the best place of the house of the women. Very similar situation came about for Daniel as he was taken to Babylon. Just come across to Daniel chapter 1. He was brought into the sphere of the king, a great Gentile king and emperor. And he also found favour in that situation. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat or with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favour and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are after your sort? Then shall he make me endanger my head to the king. And so Daniel says, prove thy servants. And verse 14, he consented to them in the matter and proved them 10 days. And that was because he was looking upon Daniel and his friends favourably. And we're told quite explicitly in Daniel that, verse 9, God had brought Daniel into favour with the prince of the eunuchs. Exactly the same thing's happening here, isn't it, in Esther and chapter 2. There's no explicit mention of God bringing her into favour, but we can see the hand of God at work. And so when we come back in Esther chapter 2 to verse 17, the outcome was that when she came before the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favour in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And so the Gentile queen had been taken out of the way, and this faithful Jewish queen, who also happened to be fair and beautiful, which is what the king was looking for, she was there as the queen, ready for the final events to unfold. We think then about Mordecai next. And Mordecai was also introduced in this second chapter in verse 5. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. We've been back to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and seen that contest between Saul and Agag. Saul the Benjamite and Agag the Amalekite. And here Mordecai is, we're told, a Benjamite, and he was also the son of Kish, just as Saul was. Saul the son of Kish, Mordecai the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So just as the events surrounding the naming of Haman set in beautiful context what's going to happen, so very much the same is the case when we look at Mordecai. And so when we have read in verse 4 of chapter 3 that Mordecai refused to do reverence to Haman, and he reveals in verse 4 he had told them that he was a Jew, we can see the principles upon which Mordecai would refuse to do this. He knew those words of God in Exodus chapter 17, that God would have war with Amalek from generation to generation. That God's purpose was to destroy the Amalekites. There was no way that Mordecai, this faithful Jew, would show reverence to an Agagite. And so he refuses to do that, regardless of the consequences and the great consequences that came of it. Not only was his life endangered, but the life of all the Jews then were in danger because of the greatness of the wrath of Haman. And yet Mordecai had faith. He knew that God wouldn't allow Haman to prevail. We come across to chapter 4, when the commandment has gone out from the king that the Jews are to be destroyed, as he'd been persuaded by Haman. In chapter 4 we know that Haman, in verse 1, rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and Esther wants to find out what the problem is, and he converses with her and brings her the message of what's going on and the danger that the Jews are in. Just think about the words of Mordecai in verse 14 to Esther. If thou altogether hold thy peace at this time, she was afraid to go in to speak to the king, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai could see the hand of God in the events going on here. She had been brought to her position in the kingdom for such a time as this. But the particular point I want to emphasise in that verse is that Mordecai had faith that whatever happened, the Jews would not be destroyed. He says, "If thou altogether hold thy peace, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place." How did he know that? Because that was God's promise. Just turn across to Jeremiah chapter 30. Jeremiah had been prophesying in the years leading up to the exile of the Jews. First of all in Babylon, and then for those who had not returned, who were still in exile in the time of King Ahasuerus. But Jeremiah, in his prophecy, as well as giving condemnation to Israel for their faithlessness and their idolatry, also gave to them God's promise that they would be preserved. And Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 10 would be words with which Mordecai was familiar. You read there, "Therefore fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, saith the Lord, neither be dismayed, O Israel. For lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return and be at rest, and be quiet, and none shall make him afraid. For I am with thee, saith Yahweh, to save thee. Though I make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished." And so Jeremiah, of course there are other prophecies and promises which we could think of. Jeremiah had given his prophecy from God that the Jews would not be destroyed, and so Mordecai knew that deliverance would arise one way or another, whether it was through Esther or not. And deliverance did arise. It's interesting to note in chapter 6 that not only did Mordecai recognise that and know that the Jews would be saved, but this was recognised even by the family of Haman when we get to Esther chapter 6 and verse 13, when Haman goes home and he reports what's happened and that Mordecai has been exalted before him. In verse 13, Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him, and he then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, "If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him." I don't know where they got that information from, but certainly it's a confirmation and a reiteration of what we saw there in Jeremiah, and also going right back to the words of God to Abraham as he was called out of Ur of the Chaldees, when he said to him, "I will curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all kindreds of the earth be blessed." Those who cursed him, like Haman, would be cursed, and so even his family could see that if it was the Jews that you've started to fall before, you will not prevail him before them, but will surely fall before him. And so the events in these chapters are dramatic, aren't they? Mordecai goes from being threatened with the gallows which have been raised up by Haman to being exalted to sit beside the king at the end of the book. And here are a series of coincidences, but they're not coincidences. They had to happen in the right way. It wasn't something which could have happened and been left to run, left to chance. You think of what happened in these events. That the gallows were erected by Haman. And then in chapter 6 and verse 1, after that, he caused the gallows to be made. The very next verse says, on that night could not the king sleep. It was on that night, when the king couldn't sleep, that he chose to read the Chronicles. Which Chronicles would he read? It was on that night that he read the Chronicles which recorded the good deed of Mordecai. If Mordecai had been exalted and rewarded at the time, then there would have been no need to reward him when we get to chapter 6. But God had been at work. He'd made sure that Mordecai wasn't rewarded and that he would be rewarded just at the right time. And then just at the right time also, Haman arrives in the court to see the king as the king considers what to do to reward Mordecai for his good work. And so we see so clearly the angels of God at work throughout the events in Mordecai's life and in the events which lead to the deliverance of the Jews, which we come to at the end of the book. I wanted to think, when we're thinking about this, of the deliverance of the Jews in the time of Esther as a pattern for the deliverance of the Jews in our times. The Jews in Esther were delivered from a planned annihilation by God's work of deliverance through Esther and Mordecai. And so also God has been at work in the 19th century and the 20th century and is at work today. To the world, it appears as a natural course of events. But with the eye of faith, based on God's promises and the words of the prophets, we can see a powerful evidence of the power and the existence of God and his work with his people, the Jews. I mean, here we are, living in 2016, a time when Israel are there as a nation in the land. But just think about the many factors which had to come together for the Jews to be there as a nation once again. Those things which came together right from the 19th century into the decades of the 20th century. There was a desire for some Jews to return to the land of their fathers. And this was spurred on in the 19th century by persecution in Russia and elsewhere. And as part of that, there was the desire to revive a common language, the Hebrew language, as the Jewish people were coming together from different parts of the world. There was that desire and the work led by Eliezer ben Yehuda to revive the language of Hebrew as a language to be spoken, a language for a nation coming together. There had to be a land which was available. And in the 19th century, much of the land of Israel was left desolate. Although there were Arabs living in the land, it was very much undercultivated. And so the land was available. And whilst there were a few Jews who wanted to go back to the land, it was persecution which really increased the desire of the Jews to have a land of their own and to return to what would become the land of Israel. As we said, in the 19th century there was the persecution from Russia. And then in the 20th century, Adolf Hitler had very much the same idea as Haman. He wanted to destroy all the Jews, the complete annihilation of the Jews in that final solution. A solution which, as Jeremiah prophesied, would never be successful. But the creating of that nation also required the Jews to be looked upon favourably. And that came out of the persecution of the Jews in the Second World War. It led to a favourable vote of the United Nations in 1947, where the United Nations voted in favour of the creation of the state of Israel. And yet that wasn't universal. There was the politics of the surrounding Arab nations who didn't want Israel to be created as a state. And yet Israel, small group of people, well outnumbered by the Arabs round about them, had some defensive capability. And so we know the history. The State of Israel was formed in 1948. Immediately the surrounding Arab nations declared war, and yet this small outnumbered people was able to defend itself, to in fact extend its territory and to secure itself as a nation. And we just think of the example of the later victory of the State of Israel in 1967 in what's known as the Six-Day War. Once again, the Arab nations wanted to fight against Israel, and as a result of that conflict, the city of Jerusalem was recaptured. Just one little example here of how small things that happen can change world events dramatically. As part of that Six-Day War and the preparation, because Israel knew that war was coming, Israel had hoped, according to Charles Messenger in his book on conflict in the 20th century, he said that Israel had hoped that Jordan would stay out of the fighting as the war commenced in June 1967. But on the first morning, Nasser, who's the leader of Egypt, telephoned the king of Jordan claiming that he had destroyed many Israeli aircraft, that his tanks were moving to link up with the Jordanians, and Hussein, king of Jordan, therefore gave the order to attack, which his forces began to do south of Jerusalem. The Israelis immediately launched attacks of their own. By the end of the 7th of June, they had seized the Arab half of Jerusalem after fierce fighting and occupied the west bank of the River Jordan. And it comments, King Hussein himself was very bitter. Both the Syrians and Iraqis had promised to send troops to help him, but neither did. And so we just see that as a comment as what Israel were expecting. They hoped that Jordan would stay out. If that was the case, they wouldn't have fought against Jordan and captured Jerusalem. But what had God said? That the city of Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And if that was God's purpose, then that's what would happen. And so we see the hand of God still at work today. As we said, in the events in the 20th century, God was at work. In the future, we know that things will change and that God's hand will be seen. It's coming back to Esther, to chapter 9. Interesting to see the comment that's made in relation to the way in which the Jews were victorious over their enemies. Esther chapter 9 verse 25 says, "But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device which he had devised against the Jews should return upon his own head, and that he, Haman, and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. The Jew haters' plans returned upon their own head." And thinking about that, we think of the future events still to come. Let's just come across to Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3 talks about those who have hated the Jews. Verse 6 says, The children of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians, that ye might remove them far from their border. Behold, I will raise them out of the place whither ye have sold them, and will return your recompense upon your own head. The haters of the Jews have their recompense returned upon their own head. And then we know the rest of the chapter goes on to describe the battle of Armageddon as God intervenes to bring salvation to Jerusalem. And we read in verse 16, Yahweh shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. The heavens and the earth shall shake. Yahweh shall be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. Here in the final conflict, God's work will not be hidden. It will indeed be revealed. And this comes out also in the chapter referred to earlier on, Ezekiel chapter 38. Just think about that also in relation to this theme. Ezekiel 38, we said at verse 2 that the aggressor which comes down from the north into the land of Israel is described in verse 2 as Gog. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the latter-day Agagite, the latter-day power which has a hatred for the Jews. And it comes down in verse 8 into the land which is brought back from the sword. And the chapter concludes after showing the victory of God in deliverance of his people. Verse 23 says, Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. And so today we're still living in that time when God isn't seen and the world refuses to accept the ways of God, the word of God, the power of God. But Ezekiel prophesies of that time to come when God will be revealed and all nations will recognise him. And so we think then of the final time of glory as it's set out in Esther. In the 9th and 10th chapters we have the reversal, when the Jews have their victory over those who hate them, and we have a picture of the kingdom of God established in type. In verse 1 of chapter 10 we read, The king Ahasuerus laid tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his might and his power and his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. And so, brothers and sisters and young people, we see in this book wonderful events, the hand of God at work, bringing salvation to his people there in the days of Esther and Mordecai. And words which give us confidence that we living in these last days, in a time when we also only see the work of God through the eye of faith, are about to come to that time when God will be revealed, and when all the nations will recognise Yahweh as the true God, the great creator and the God of Israel.